Hello, I'm Daniel McCarthy, Vice President for the Collegiate Network at ISI and the editor of Modern Age. I'm joined right now by my good friend Sam Gregg, who is at the AIER, and we'll ask him about AIER in just a moment here. Sam is a great economist, but he's not just an economist. He's someone who is a political economist, someone who's also a social thinker, who's able to bring together the role of free markets with the greater sense of freedom in a society and virtue in society as well. So Sam is very much in the mold of the kind of economics that ISI has always cultivated and promoted. So welcome, Sam.
Thanks, Stan. It's great to be here.
So tell us a little bit at first about your work at AIER.
So I have the very grand title of Friedrich Hayek Chair in Economics and Economic History. But my focus is really upon making the wider case for markets at a time in which I think it's fair to say markets are on the defense. Across the political spectrum, in all parts of the world, we're no longer living in the 1980s when it comes to how people think about economic policy or what is considered to be the climate of opinion. The climate of opinion right now, I don't think is with free markets, generally speaking. So part of my responsibility is to try and articulate the case for free markets in a way that's fitted up for the conditions that we're living in now, which are not those of the 1980s. We live in a very different world. We don't have the Soviet Union, but we do have China. We have debates across the political spectrum about the economy. There's more willingness, I think, across the political spectrum to entertain ideas about interventionism. And that's a relatively new situation for a lot of us who grew up in the post-Cold War era. So that's what a lot of my work is focused upon now, trying to remake, if you like, the case for markets in a way that I think is suited for the conditions of the time. It's not a new thing. I think free marketers have always done this, but some of the challenges now are not the same as those of 20 years ago.
Do you find that there are deficiencies in the way economics is taught in most colleges and universities today?
Absolutely, yes. One is, I think, economic history is very much a marginal discipline now. That wasn't always the case. And I think there's been a gradual shift towards economics being taught almost as econometrics, and that's all there is. And so if you open up your average economics journal today, what do you find? You find math, and you find algebra. And I often like to say that a lot of economists today, whatever school of thought they come from, they know more and more about less and less. And I think that's partly because the bigger vision that informed, I think, great economists ranging from Adam Smith to F.A. Hayek, that bigger vision of what economics is about, the way it fits into our understanding of culture, society, the law, etc. That's just not as present now as it was, say, 50 years ago. And it's not just on among what you might call those on the Keynesian left, but I even think among some free market circles there's a tendency to basically push everything through this mathematical lens. And maths has its place in economics, but I think in many respects it's been reduced to that and it's become a very almost technical type of discipline rather than a more humanistic one.
What first drew you to economics as a field, and where would you advise perhaps a student who has to be an autodidact in the beginning, where would you advise a student to begin today?
Well, what drew me to economics was the fact that at the time I was growing up, there were immense economic debates in the 1980s and 1990s. It was really a time when free markets came back into fashion after having been cast into academic darkness really after the Keynesian revolution. And it was very clear that there were people willing to question the then existing consensus, with very much the sort of Keynesian, juridious, interventionist consensus that existed for a long period of time. So that was one of the interesting things for me. But in terms of today, if someone said to me, what should people read? Well, I think reading some of the older texts, whether it's literally The Wealth of Nations, it could have used a good editor, shall we say, but I think the very basic things that are necessary to know about economics are more or less contained there. I remember very well I think it was in the early 2000s, ISI actually put out a number of books, biographies of economists. So there was one on Ludwig von Mises, I believe. There was another on Wilhelm Röpke. And I thought those were very good because they introduced you to economists rather than just economics. And for many people who want to just learn something about these things, about this discipline, reading the lives of these thinkers is very interesting because you realize that some of the issues that they were dealing with today, not just the purely economic issues, but also how economics relates to culture, to law, to politics, to history, to foreign policy. They lived these things in a way that I think is very instructive for us to learn about today.
There was something of an intellectual revolution in favor of free markets from the 1970s through the 1990s, really the last phase of the Cold War. The communist project in the Soviet Union was bankrupt, and finally academics were starting to admit that. While in the West, the Keynesian project, the New Deal, the welfare states that have been built up in the post-war era, they were coming into great fiscal difficulties, and we're also running into problems across the board in terms of administration, in terms of costs, in terms of even the basic philosophy informing them, and the willingness of the public to continue to give politicians carte blanche as long as they provided for these welfare benefits. So I'm curious, as you became interested in economics in this period, was there a figure, whether Milton Friedman or perhaps someone from the Austrian School of Economics, but were there particular economists that you were inspired by and that you discovered and thought, oh, this is an interesting critique of all of the mainstream Keynesians who are out there right now?
So my favorite economist is Adam Smith, and he underwent somewhat of a revival, I think it's fair to say, in the 1970s and 1980s as a consequence of some of the changes that you're referring to. But I would say that in terms of 20th century economic thinkers, for me, Hayek is the one that stands out the most. Partly because I think one of the great things he pointed out was that economics teaches us that there's a lot of things we don't know, and that by intervening into the economy in the way that was done, as you're describing, particularly after the Second World War, you're bound to make lots of mistakes because there are all sorts of things that you just can't know, but those things are really important when you're trying to design things like policy. So that insight in some of his writings on the knowledge problem, the nature of competition, but also because he was very interested in developing a type of synthetic approach to economics. So he was one of the first people to really start talking about the significance of legal institutions for how economies work. He was also very good, I think, in a almost Tocquevillian way. He was very good at looking at what you might call some of the deeper impulses that shape economic culture. Now, Tocqueville today for us is, of course, everyone reads Tocqueville, but in Hayek's time, in the 1940s and 1950s, Tocqueville was a pretty marginal figure. Most people didn't know very much about him. And I think that Hayek, when he was looking for trying to explain why it was that so many societies had shifted in this social democratic, socialist New Deal direction, he came up with explanations through reading people like Tocqueville, through reading people like Lord Acton. In other words, taking history and political science seriously in a way that was less evident, I think, among a lot of other economists of the time. So that's what attracts me to him. He's really a synthetic thinker who's able to bring together his particular economic insights, which, as you know, are heavily influenced, although not exclusively, by the Austrian school, with philosophical and historical discourse. And that's extremely attractive to me.
Do you recall how you first encountered the thought of Friedrich Hayek?
Yes, I can remember very clearly reading a little pamphlet called The Intellectuals and Socialism. Now, most people, when you ask that question, they'll say The Road to Serfdom. I read that, but that wasn't the first one. It was Intellectuals and Socialism, because I was interested in why is it that people think they can somehow redesign economies made up of trillions of dollars, billions of people making choices and decisions all the time. How is it they think that they can actually design these things? How they can sort of try and reorientate this in a particular way through using top-down policy tools. And I think Hayek's explanation about why intellectuals were so attractive to socialism provides a very good insight into that, in the sense that they really started to think that, well, if we just pull a lever here and do this and do that, we can solve the economic problem. And so his explanation for that was less about economics, but more about how intellectuals think about the world. And I think those insights are equally applicable today.
How do these broad categories, society, politics, economics, How do they fit together? What is the sort of big picture, perhaps simplified, but an overview of, because you've quite rightly mentioned, economics can sometimes be reduced unfairly to econometrics and is seen as simply being a kind of utilitarianism. But I think you have a much broader view that is of interest to our viewers.
So I would suggest that, to my mind, the Scottish Enlightenment actually provides us with this way of thinking about economics and how it relates to everything else. Because if you read people like Adam Smith, or if you read people like David Hume, clearly their contributions to economic thought are very profound. But they're also thinking about lots of other things at the time. And so they were very interested in what Hume called the science of man. And so they were trying to think about, how do we look at society and how do we try and identify different parts of society, whether it's the economy or the legal system or politics, and how do these things relate to each other? So they were very much insistent upon thinking in what we would call today an interdisciplinary way, which is, as you know, far less common in the academy in our time. So that's one thing. I think the other thing which also provides you with a type of interpretive key is to ask yourself questions about human nature. Because human nature, to my mind, doesn't change. And if you can identify what are the core features of human nature, about which people disagree, right? But if you can identify those core features, that can give you a type of interpretive key as to how all these different things fit together. So if you accept that humans are fallible but free, if you accept that we have reason but it's limited, if you accept that we can be creative but we can also be incredibly stupid, that is a really interesting way of saying, okay, well, that's how that applies in the economy, but I can also see how that vision or understanding of human nature affects law or affects politics. So I think, and I think many of the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers were very, very perceptive about this in the way that they thought about human beings, how they thought about the social order, and how they managed to integrate these things in a way that I think we find very difficult to replicate today.
What would you say to conservatives who may feel that economics is outside of their purview? They're very interested perhaps in religion, theology, very interested perhaps in political theory, but economics they view with somewhat of a degree of disdain perhaps, maybe because of the way economics is treated by both econometrics and also by progressives of various kinds. How should conservatives properly view economics within their worldview?
Well, I think that depending on which type of conservative you're talking about, but my suggestion would be that conservatives, in many respects, are realists about the human condition. They're anti-utopian for the most part, right? And I think that economics is a really good way of imbibing a more realist understanding of what human beings are and how they interact with each other. Now, that doesn't mean that we're homo economicus. That doesn't mean that we're just purely utility maximizers. That doesn't mean that we're just purely consumption-driven creatures. But it does mean that if you have an understanding of how the economy works, then I think the conservative can actually say, well, this is why we need safeguards. This is why we need important institutions. This is why we also need a type of moral culture that will shape the way in which people interact with each other economically, just as they do in the legal system, just as they do in politics. So I think economics, to the extent that it is relentlessly focused upon certain realities about the human person, to the extent that conservatives are anti-utopian, to the extent that they adopt a certain skepticism about grand schemes for reorganizing society, economics is a useful tool for helping them to explain why grand schemes of trying to reorganize society from the top down usually fail, in fact, they always fail, and do a lot of damage to society as a whole.
Economics is about constraints and limits as well as abundance. Would that be fair to say?
Oh, absolutely, because it teaches us that we can't know everything. It also teaches us that we have to make choices. So when we choose X, that usually excludes Y and Z. It also teaches us that things like prices are a reality, and that if you try and break out of the price system, you end up with very bad economic systems. I think it also teaches us that we have to address, speaking of limits, the problem of scarcity. That scarcity is a real human challenge that for the most of human history, humans have not dealt with particularly well. We've basically, for most of history, lived at a subsistence level. The notion of abundance, I think, is a relatively new one, at least economically speaking. And to that extent, I think that economics provides us with certain insights into reality, which we, if we acknowledge and understand, give us a better prospect of creating greater wealth for more people more consistently over long periods of time.
Inflation has been a major issue in America, especially in our most recent election. How should one view the causes of inflation and how to fight them?
So I tend to think that Milton Friedman was right when he said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena, by which he meant when central banks push too much money into the economy, then it results in the prices going up beyond what they otherwise would normally do, right? So there's a lot of money going around trying to find places to go, and that tends to push up or devalue, if you like, the value of money. So it's a serious problem because it introduces uncertainty, because if it's constantly going up, then you're constantly guessing, well, can I really afford that? Can I do that? It introduces, I think, for people who are on fixed incomes or who are on the bottom end of the economic scale, they find it much harder to cope with things like inflation. Wealthy people actually sometimes benefit from inflation because they tend to be more financially sophisticated and they know how to play that game. And that's not actually helpful either. And it also, I think, reflects the fact that sometimes people are resorting to what we call monetary policy to try and solve fiscal problems. So one of the ways that Keynesians and neo-Keynesians have traditionally dealt with things like falling demand is just push more money into the economy. Okay, well, it's like a drug. It gives you a short high, but then you come down. And the only way that you can really get out of this is a very difficult process of making sure that you have the value of the money coming down to what it should be, to the real value of what the money is, rather than something that's been artificially inflated, ultimately, I think, by bad monetary policy.
Who was John Maynard Keynes, and what's the significance of his economic thought?
John Maynard Keynes is probably the most significant economic thinker since Adam Smith. Now, I'm quite critical of Keynes, but I don't think there's any denying his sheer influence. And he was particularly influential, I think, because one, he was one of the very first economists who was really good at talking to big non-economist audiences. That's one thing. He was very skilled at writing. He was very skilled at speaking. And he was telling people that if the government does certain things, if the government intervenes in certain ways, if it manages monetary policy in certain ways, if it involves itself more actively in the economy via fiscal policy, it can manage the economy so that we can avoid the ups and downs, the booms and busts of the business cycle. He also, I think, gave us concepts of great aggregates, because before Keynes, people tended to think about economics at a sort of micro level. He's really the father of macroeconomics. Which means you think about GDP or overall employment numbers or overall inflation levels, all of which can be quite helpful, but also disguises certain important realities of what's really going on in the economy underneath these big aggregates. And the other thing about big aggregates is it gives governments, he believed, the capacity to make choices to drive the economy in one way rather than another, so that they can avoid some of the ups and downs of the business cycle. So his book, he came to fame with The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which was his critique of the Treaty of Versailles. And of course, his general theory really changed the way in which economics was taught and economics was understood. Now, I happen to think that, generally speaking, that the results of that have been not good, but there's no doubt that he changed the way that economics is understood. And we still, in many respects, live in a Keynesian world.
What can organizations like ISI do to help bring about a better understanding of economics, not simply as a maximization of GDP, but as something related to human nature?
Well, I think that the work that organizations like ISI do in introducing people to some of the great books of economics, whether it's The Wealth of Nations, whether it's, and great economic thinkers, whether it's Jean-Baptiste Say or Friedrich Bastiat or people like David Ricardo, reading some of the classic texts I think is very important, because I think they actually have a much more humanistic view of economics and what its purpose is. That's one thing. I also think that providing people with a basic introduction to economics. I'm sure you know that most people don't have a very good understanding of economics. It's not taught at secondary school for the most part. Even in universities, I think its influence is much less than it used to be. So providing people with basic, let's call it Econ 101 courses, literature to explain basic things like how prices work, supply and demand, the function of interest rates, what is fiscal policy, what is monetary policy, providing people with those very basic tools and then showing them how a good understanding of these things can contribute to wider human flourishing as a whole. And I think the advantage that an organization like ISI has is it does take things like human nature very seriously. Now, economists will say, well, we just look at certain parts of the human person and the way that that applies and works out in the economy. And that's fine, but I think that an organization like ISI and my own, the American Institute for Economic Research where I work, we tend to take a broader view of these things. And I think that's important because that makes economics more attractive to people. And I think it helps them to understand economics in the context of the conditions they're living in.
You've said that there is a kind of rising tide of skepticism or criticism directed at free markets. Where do you think that's coming from?
Oh, there's many reasons. I think sometimes these things go in cycles, right? So we go between interventionism and then we go back to economic liberalization. I think in many respects the history of the 20th century sort of reflects that. I also think that some of it flows, particularly in the case of the United States, I think a lot of it flows from the 2008 financial crisis and Great Recession. I think that the case for free markets took some major hits as a consequence of that. Now, I happen to think that both of those events were primarily the result of bad monetary policy, bad housing policy. In fact, we could sit down and I could give you a whole thing about why I think government intervention was the primary cause. But it doesn't matter because that's not the narrative that won. The narrative that won was that free markets ran amok, it was unregulated, and that's why we need more regulation, and that's why we need to be more skeptical about markets, etc. So if you're asking me for the number one thing that I think did a lot of damage to the credibility of markets, it's the financial crisis, the Great Recession, and the inability or the failure of free market economists to win the argument about what the causes were. I don't mean in the sense of proving that the interventionists were wrong. I think the interventionists were wrong, but the popular narrative did not reflect that. The popular narrative reflected the more interventionist explanation of what went wrong.
And is there perhaps a version of that difficulty that is even broader, where after the end of the Cold War, a lot of the benefits of free markets were taken for granted, and perhaps those making the case for free markets ceased to be as energetic and as original as perhaps in the generation before, with Hayek and Friedman and others, who really felt the need to restore a case for free markets at a time of maximum Keynesianism. Is there a need for a kind of revival of not just economic thought, but economic thought that reaches a wide public?
Yes, and in fact, we can think of some. You mentioned Friedman. Think, for example, of his documentary series "Free to Choose." That was immensely influential in terms of shaping how people thought about the economy and opened up a lot of people's minds to the possibilities of markets vis-a-vis the alternatives. I don't see too many economists doing that so much today. There are some economists who do popular podcasts, for example. There are economists who write for more popular magazines, etc. But I think I think you're right in the sense that after the Cold War and the collapse of communism, I think a lot of free marketers thought, we've won. The argument is over. And this was a time, as you know, in the 1990s, you had people like Francis Fukuyama saying it's the end of history, we're all going to end up in liberal democracies and free markets, it's just a question of how quickly all of us get there. There might be bumps on the road, but that's the Hegelian nirvana that we're all headed for. And that clearly is not true. It wasn't true. I remember being somewhat skeptical of it at the time because I'm not a determinist. But it was really interesting to see how many people sort of bought into that. And I think to many respects sort of thought, well, we've won the argument. Now we can get back to sort of doing the more esoteric things that a lot of scholars tend to be attracted to, and forgot about the need to keep making these arguments because they're not always self-evident to people, right? A lot of economics involves counterintuitive thinking, and that's something that needs to be taught over and over and over again. You can't just assume that people will pick it up, because I think people tend in many respects to see the interventionist case as, well, that's sort of, yes, that's how the world works. And I don't think they understand that that's not how the world works, that markets provide you and free market thoughts provide you a better explanation of how economies work. But I think that a lot of free marketers just stop doing that very basic educational work that's even more necessary today.
Well, your own work, your own prolific publishing is helping to fill that gap. So thank you, Sam Gregg, for joining us, and look forward to talking to you again.
Great. Thank you.